Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandalmongers podcast. Hello, Andrew. It's your turn to be abroad, it seems.
It is. I'm sorry, I can't be on an outside chalet veranda, but I'm in Switzerland. So bringing the latest news from around the world.
Well, I've got some news. I think we haven't seen the Apple data. Most of our listeners are on Apple or Spotify. But I think this was the week we passed 100,000 downloads.
Gosh.
I think so.
Gosh, that's great. It's lovely to see the listeners going up and looking at old programs as well.
Yes, the people are finding the old stuff. Well, I mean, 100,000 people, or maybe one person 100,000 times. And if you're listening, Jennifer, my mother-in-law, thanks a lot for doing that.
And
we're also
very successful.
We're also in the charts. You don't know this because I'm the one that's desperate for validation in terms of our double act. And I look at these charts, and we started appearing in a few unlikely places, like fairly low down, like 125. But in places like Finland, New Zealand, Ireland, even Argentina, can you believe?
Gosh. Well, maybe we should be changing the focus of the program. We haven't done anything on those areas yet.
Well, I think we also found the secret to our moderate success. Ellen Zelinsky wrote from America saying how much she enjoyed the shows, but she particularly liked listening to your voice.
Your voice?
No, your voice.
What? My voice? Gosh.
Well, she says she's got the audio version of Traitor King. And the author's dulcet tones are a real bonus. Is that you?
That's me, yes. Dulcet suggests going to sleep.
Well, maybe that's the secret to our success. People are using us to nod off. Well, I think Ellie Mae from Canada. Hello, Ellie Mae, if you're listening. She likes our accents too. Maybe she means me as well. Who knows? And quite a few people have been joining and saying nice things. In fact, this particular episode, we should probably get around to introducing, was also suggested by a listener.
Yes, absolutely. And it was a very good suggestion, I think. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Laura has to say.
Yep. So Catherine Giovanni, or Di Giovanni, from Washington, D.C., if you're listening, thank you for your great idea. And it led us to reach out to our friend Laura, who's going to come and speak to us about the Mitfords. Possibly the poshest women ever to have lived. Andrew would understand. He has a very similar background himself.
Right. Well, I mean, there is this great interest in Mitfords, which continues. I mean, there have been dozens of books, but Laura, I think, is one of the best-known writers about them. But yes, there is a fascination, and I think people just can't get enough of them.
There was a very good, actually, sort of all right TV series. Did you see it? It was star-studded, glossy, had American money in it, I think. Just recently, of the book The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford, which is, I guess, is the book that really cemented their reputation as these eccentric, crazy, sort of slightly out there aristocratic women from the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, no, it's a slightly different sort of. Well, I suppose there's a whole series of scandals with their lives, really, particularly with Unity, the one who was the great supporter of Hitler.
Yeah, well, just as a very brief intro, I mean, they had this remarkable, intense, strange childhood. Like I say, they're very rich, very posh. They didn't seem to go to school very much. They sort of roamed around the family estates with imaginary worlds and inventing their own language. What was it, 5 or 6 girls and a boy? Very intense friendships, alliances, which they carried on into their sort of adult lives, where they were so famous. I mean, they were like the most famous women, perhaps in Europe in the 30s. Everything they did was written about. Photographs were taken. They would be called influencers now.
Yeah, and I mean, the last of them only died in 2014. So, you know, they dominated in the sense that the landscape for a long period, because, as you say, really the 30s was their heyday.
And then, you know, in different ways, they get drawn into the politics of that time, and that sort of decade's fascination with dictators of various kinds. As you say, Unity, Mitford ends up shooting herself. We shouldn't give the game away, but she does. I think most people would know that. She's so in despair when Britain and Germany go to war because she is totally in love with Hitler. Crikey.
Yeah, no, it'd be fascinating to know how their lives would have played out if they'd been born, let's say, 30 years later, in the 60s or something. But yeah, it is an extraordinary sort of saga. I mean, you couldn't make up a lot of it.
No, impossible to imagine now, I think, actually, as well. Okay, well, I think that's probably given people enough background. Shall we go to Laura?
I think we should.
All right. See you in a minute.
See you in a minute.
Laura, welcome back.
It's lovely to see you both again.
Well, you've written such great books. We both loved your book on the Mitfords. I mean, it's a very well-covered subject, but very fresh.
Well, somebody who is online far too much, namely me, just tweeted, "Some books you just luxuriate in." I'd say that of this perfect shimmering summer read, especially for anybody about to go on a UK countryside holiday. Oh, and we're just about to interview the author.
Oh, Phil. Oh, my goodness. What a lovely thing. Oh, that's so nice of you. I wrote it very quickly. Sometimes that sort of works because you just get on with it, you know. But as you say, Andrew, they're not exactly not written about, the Mitfords. And when I was asked to do it, I thought, oh, come on, this again. But then there's always something, you know, why are they still fascinating people? Well, you know, and you come at it in a fresh way, and there is something new. Because what amazes me about them really is there is this sort of twee and twinkly aspect, you know, the sort of people who, oh, I want to dress like Debo, or let's see, you know, all this kind of thing. And then you think, well, hang on a minute, you know, there's actually a rather dark and perturbing side to these, at least three of these women, which somehow gets absorbed into the Mitford whole, which I suppose is down to Nancy Mitford and the pursuit of love and the construction of what one might call the Mitford myth, which, and that book does purge them of darkness and in a way was their reputational savior, maybe.
You met several of them, readers. You met several of them.
I met two of them. I met Diana, which was an event. She was wonderful. She was so lovely to me. And I met Deborah, who was also brilliant, but far more brisk. And, you know, because she was the normal one, so cool. But Diana was, you know, you're meeting a woman who was fairly close with Hitler and obviously married Oswald Mosely. And I was absolutely petrified. And she was, what surprised me, she was extremely warm, extremely funny, as the Mitfords are. And one just could not. The enigma of Diana is indecipherable as far as I can tell. And I'm now writing a book about her and Mosely, the marriage, and it's you know, it's a conundrum to say the least.
I mean, perhaps for our viewers, you should just give us a quick rundown on the 6 Mitford girls, and indeed the brother Tom too, who's also quite interesting.
Yes, he is. Yes. Okay. So they were born into the English, you know, the heart of the English countryside, the Cotswolds, between 1904 and 1920. So you've got the 6 Mitford girls. You've got Nancy, obviously the writer. You've got Pamela, also an enigma, but known for breeding chickens and so forth. But I think there was a whole other side to Pamela, really. Then you've got then you've got the brother, Tom, who is, yes, an extremely interesting person, the one son, who was killed right at the end of the Second World War. Then you've got Diana, the beauty, and extremely clever woman, but, you know, as I say, enigmatic. Then you've got Unity, the woman who became very close to Hitler and shot herself on the day that war was declared, but didn't kill herself. Then you've got Jessica, who became an ardent communist and eloped to the Spanish Civil War with her first husband, Esmond Romilly, who was rumoured to be Churchill's son, and a real hardline communist, a Corbynista woman, or more to the left than that. And then you've got Deborah, who became the Duchess of Devonshire, and whose rebellion, as I've said before, took the form of being completely sane, and had an extremely successful and wonderful life. And she only died in 2014. So that was the last of the Mitford girls. Then you've got these two very interesting parents who are presented again in Nancy's The Pursuit of Love as this immutable sort of English marriage, the Lord and Lady Alconley. And of course, by the time that book came out in 1945, that whole family had fragmented. As I say, Tom was dead. The marriage between the Redesdales, Lord and Lady Redesdale is their real name, had fallen apart. So that book, when one reads it in the knowledge of the real Mitfords, does take on a tremendous poignancy over and above the poignancy of the novel itself. David Mitford, who only got the title by default, his brother was killed in the First War, was he's portrayed in that novel, Uncle Matthew, as the kind of roaring, rampaging, eccentric English aristocrat. He was a more vulnerable character than that, really, and extremely bad with money and lost sort of everything. His wife, Sydney, again, an enigmatic woman, very interesting woman. I mean, today she'd have been probably running, she'd be a CEO or she'd be doing something, she was capable of anything, I think, but instead had all these children and ended up during the Second World War more or less commuting between visiting Diana, who'd been imprisoned in Holloway because of being a fascist sympathizer, commuting between Holloway and her own cottage in Oxfordshire, where she was more or less nursed to Unity, who was pretty much an invalid after putting a bullet in her brain. So that was Sydney's life. And in a way, Sydney interests me the most of all of them, the mother, extraordinary woman. So you can see why we remain interested in them.
I just find that the contrast between the world you describe, I'm going to keep quoting you yourself, because the lines I just want to read. These girls were expected to become wives, mothers, propagators of their class, the kind of women who appeared at state balls in slightly ill-fitting satin and then tramped through Gloucestershire in good tweed. And that's lovely. And that's kind of, even in war, and it's charming, and they have their private language. And then there's this other world that they get into, which is dictators and war. And you say Diana was charming. She would have been the willing partner and perhaps co-conspirator with a man who could have been Britain's dictator, who would probably have happily sent people in cattle trucks to gas chambers.
It's unfathomable. It really is unfathomable. I mean, I think my book, which you're so lovely about, and I really appreciate it, I think I begin by saying it's an unrepeatable set of circumstances. Those 6 highly individualistic girls at a time when the world imploded. And this image, which really sums the Mitfords up, of the house, the house in Oxfordshire, and a kind of room in it that would. Unity and Jessica were very, very close, although Unity was an out-and-out Nazi and Jessica was an out-and-out communist. And they divided the room up. On one side was a bust of Lenin and a red flag, and the other side was, swastikas and black shirts.
Amazing.
So but they meant it. But they're also, as I say in the book, showing off to Nanny. I think Nancy and Diana would have been remarkable women in any family. The cleverness of them, the scintillating, bright brain of Nancy, and this remarkable obduracy, this darkness in Diana, along with her extraordinary charisma, her physical charisma, the charisma of her spirit. And I think the others sort of followed in their wake. I think it's absolutely extraordinary to think that in 1930, the Redesdale parents were worried about Nancy cutting her hair and not being married, and regarded her as a bit of an outrage, writing these sort of sub-Evelyn Waugh little novels. And by 1932, Diana had walked out on her husband, and set up as Oswald Mosely's mistress. And that from that point, all the dominoes fell. I think Unity was influenced by Diana. I think Jessica was in rebellion against Unity. But that, even to say that, sort of minimizes it, because they didn't just do it. They weren't just, what's the opposite of it? The vice signaling. They weren't just, showing. They were showing off, but they also meant it. I mean, they went to the courage of their ill-conceived convictions was that they lived them through. Diana went to prison. Unity shot herself. Jessica, who'd been living in London in a house pretty close to Harrods, went to live in Rotherhithe, where her baby died because there was a measles epidemic which claimed the lives of many babies. She was part of the world that she had married into by marrying a communist. They lived what they believed, and that's what I find so extraordinary about them, really.
And the dynamic is so interesting, and the shifting alliances, because I mean, after all, Diana went to prison partly on the evidence of her sister Nancy, yes, who sort of betrayed her.
Yes, she did. Nancy was my entry point, which I suppose is true of lots of people. We read those novels when we're teenagers and we're instantly compelled by the world the literary world that she creates is extraordinarily vivid and singular, and but then when you read about Nancy is an extremely complicated woman, and she talks in one of her novels about the personal and the political and how they can't be, they're inextricable. And certainly that's the case with her, because, Deborah said to me, well, Nancy was always jealous of Diana because Diana was so good looking, and all Nancy's friends, like Evelyn Moore and everything, they all sort of fell madly in love with Diana. But at the same time, Nancy was genuinely on the side of the angels in the politics of the Second World War. And I have thought when she went to the Home Office and said, my sister is a very dangerous person, I have thought about what one would do in those circumstances if I had a sister who was openly consorting with the Nazi high command. But Diana was very resentful of Nancy still when I went and met Diana. She said Nancy was the most disloyal person I ever knew, which equally I can understand that Nancy, who was often called by people a spiteful person, that was a particular example of spite, because she also, Nancy, and this intrigues me, and I only found out this quite recently, Nancy also denounced her sister Pamela, who everyone thinks of as this mild countrywoman. But in fact, she was married to a man called Derek Jackson, who was also a fascist sympathizer. And I always thought, oh, Pam didn't take any notice whether she'd been married to a fascist or she wouldn't have, it wouldn't have touched her. But maybe it did. Maybe it did. And Pamela, who everyone thinks of as so lovely, when Nancy died in 1973 from a very, very agonizing cancer, and Pamela had nursed her, and she said to Diana, well, let's face it, she's wasted 3 years of our lives, nursing her through this cancer. And I thought, gosh, there's a lot more to Pamela than meets the eye.
Well, you hint at her being a lesbian too, didn't you?
Oh, well, she was. Did I hint? I think I've found out subsequently that she
was right. Late onset lesbianism.
Some of my hinting was I should have been more explicit. Like David Redesdale, when his marriage broke up with Sydney, went and lived with his parlourmaid. And I thought, oh, well, maybe he just wants someone to, cook his sausages. But in fact, it was a relationship.
So new things are still coming out.
Well, maybe I was just, I don't know, maybe I was just, my brain was too crowded to pursue every line as I should have done to its end. Yeah.
In many ways, Unity was the one who was closest to the Nazis. I mean, Diana got married in front of Hitler, but I mean, Unity sort of was in love with Hitler. And I mean, there's even a suggestion she may have had his child. Or certainly, and you say she shot herself in September 1939, but she didn't actually die till after the war. Yeah. But she came back and was never interviewed and was allowed to sort of live on. And then the various stories about her being in a maternity hospital during the war. Have you been able to follow up those links? I mean, the idea of Hitler's son living on in Surrey is an intriguing one.
I don't buy that, actually. I do. That was something I mentioned in the book, that I actually didn't believe there was any more to it. But when we're talking what you just said, Andrew, about there's more to come out, I mean, boy, is there more to come out about Unity, I would say. You know more about these things than I do. I mean, under the 100-year rule or whatever, I don't know. But I cannot get my head around what Unity was do. Right, so Unity, who, I mean, she herself, I think, started a rumor that she'd had some sort of fling with Oswald Mosely. But which would be rubbish. But
on the billiard table.
Oh, you know the details. Blackballing. But she certainly, when Diana left her first husband, Brian Guinness, who was rich and lovely, and I think drove Diana mad. Diana was a real radical in every possible sense of the word. And she almost wanted to test her perfect life to its, I mean, even now, to do what she did and walk out on her husband and go and set up as the mistress of a married man who was at that time not the pariah that he became, but was the leader of the new party, or about to become the leader of the new party. And of course, as you will know, was regarded as a savior by many people, was regarded as the foremost politician in the land. He was a conservative, he was Labour. Both parties thought of him as a future prime minister. He then, as I say, formed the new party when Ramsay MacDonald wouldn't go along with his plans for the economy. But given the state that the economy was in at that time, not dissimilar to now, a man coming along who appeared to have answers, I can see how a very young woman, and one forgets how young they were, Diana, was compelled by him. And of course, he was regarded as extremely attractive, and he did sleep with, that famous vote Labour, sleep Tory, that was his mantra. And he did sleep with his stepmother, and he did sleep with, I think, both his sisters-in-law, certainly one. He was married to Lord Curzon's daughter, Cynthia, who died young, and he didn't immediately marry Diana. He continued to have an affair with Baba Metcalfe, his sister-in-law. And in fact, it was because of that Diana and Unity first went to Germany in September 1933, because Diana was thinking, well, he's off wherever he was, Italy or whatever, with Baba Metcalfe. I'm going to do something. And they went to Munich, where they got taken up by Hitler's sort of PR man, Putzi Hanf. Oh, God, I can't say his name. Hanfgenstill or something, forgive me. And went to Nuremberg, and it all sort of went from there. And I can see from Diana's point of view, well, first of all, she was thinking of Mosely and thinking of advancing Mosley's career. And she was trying to get permission from the Nazis to set up a commercial radio station that would supposedly finance the British Union of Fascists, which had then become Mosley's party. Well, whether there was more to that or not, we don't know at this stage. But Unity and Unity's psychology, I don't pretend to understand. But Unity became compelled in a far more mad way. also she'd have thought she was outdoing Diana. You've got Mosely, but I'm going to have the top guy. I mean, the way she writes about Hitler, oh, the blissful Führer, the blissful Führer was in such a rage. Oh, it was so thrilling. I mean, it's to read that stuff in the Mitford idiom is really quite something. But anyway, she kept going to Munich. Her parents, God knows what they were doing, God knows what they were thinking. Because initially they were very angry about it, angry with Diana. Why have you taken Unity or Bobo, or whatever they called her, to meet that gang of murderous pests? But by 1935 or whatever, they seemed to be endorsing it. And in February 1935, Unity finally met Hitler. She'd done this thing, Deborah said, today she'd have been arrested as a stalker, just sitting in his favorite restaurant in Munich, the Osteria Bavaria, and just waiting for him to notice her, which eventually happened. And then she became part of his inner circle. I don't think an affair. Well, Diana said she'd have slept with him if he'd asked her, but he never asked. There are terrible rumors about Unity sleeping with stormtroopers and sleeping with. I simply don't know. I don't think anyone really knows what to believe. We do know she asked for contraception advice. So she was doing something or hoping to do something. But what was going on? What was going on in this country? What did they think? How was she allowed to do this? They knew she could. Yeah, go on, sorry.
Sorry, how were they viewed in this country?
Well, it seems to me in rather a sort of, I don't know, no one seems to have taken it sufficiently seriously, because apart from anything else, she was related to Winston Churchill. And by marriage, but related. I mean, Churchill had influence over her. Yes. And she clearly was having some sort of influence because, for example, the Anschluss, and by this time she really was, I think she met Hitler, I think it was 140 times, but she was at the rallies, of course, well, lots of people were, we know that, but she was at the Olympic Games, as was Diana, in 1936, and in 1938, she wrote to Winston Churchill to say, the Anschluss is a wonderful thing. And they're really, really happy about it, the Austrians. They're so happy to have the Führer. And one of them said to me, can I kiss the hand that the Führer has touched, i.e. hers, just pure lunacy. But meanwhile, her father, Lord Redesdale, had stood up in the Lords and said, sort of supporting the Anschluss. It was almost like he was ventriloquizing with Goebbels working him. And then, of course, he, as Nancy put it, recanted like Latimer, Lord Redesdale, and I think suffered very greatly over ever having been part of the Anglo-German Fellowship. But I mean, you, Andrew, you're the, you know all about Edward VIII and the Anglo-German.
This is what I found as somebody who's interested in the politics of this decade. This is the thing about your book that I found really, really interesting, because it reminds you just how close it came, the depth of sympathy for dictators of all kinds, but especially the Nazis, the complete loss of faith in democracy, which just seemed to have failed, the flirtation with new ways of doing things, which usually involved a strong man with energy, which was Mosely. As you say, he'd moved from left to right and back again. He was just basically a man with the drive and charisma. He looks very much like Britain's Mussolini or possibly Britain's Hitler. And
who wasn't genuinely funding him, but yes, sorry.
No, but I just felt that you show a world that is teetering on the brink of actually going there. And it's amazing that it doesn't, actually. And maybe that's partly because when people like, Unity and Diana started doing what they were doing, rather than being embraced and celebrated, they were actually kind of mocked. They were seen as being a bit silly by certain factions with influence within British society.
Yes. And Mosely, I think the peak of fascism was, I think it was 1935, I think. And from then on, the people who backed him, including Rothermere, really backed away. And he just, as you say, that maybe that sort of British gift for irony and just finding things ridiculous. But unity was, as I say, no one can fathom her psychology, really. You could say she's mad, you can say she's evil, you can say that the Nazis unleashed the madness in her. She was always a bit of an oddball, in that she was the least physically attractive of those very good-looking sisters. She looked like Diana, but sort of a bit odd, like an odd version of Diana. I'm sure Diana always said it wouldn't have mattered what I did, unity would have gone her way, but whether that was her way of assuaging her own guilt about it, I don't know. But unity did have a loose tongue, and certainly in 1939 she was telling Hitler that we weren't prepared for war. How many anti-aircraft guns or whatever. Obviously, he would have known those things. But so when she shot herself and the bullet just lodged in her brain and they couldn't move it, and Hitler said to her, do you want to stay here or do you want to go back to England? And she said, I'd like to go back to England. And he got her moved to neutral Switzerland. And her parents didn't know what had happened. Nobody really knew what had happened. And then her supposed lover, Janos von Almashi, who I think must have been the brother of the English Patient or a relation of the English Patient, the novel. I think that's right. He rang the Redesdales and said she's alive, but she's ill, etc., etc. I mean, just shocking what they went through, really. And then finally, at the beginning of 1940, she was transported from Bern to England, to Folkestone, which I think took 4 days. So Sidney Redesdale and Deborah, poor bloody Deborah, went to Switzerland to get her back. But of course, when she came back on a stretcher, and you see these pictures of Lord Redesdale waiting to collect her, and I mean, my God. Of course, there were questions in the house. Was she really an invalid? Was this a ruse to get her out of being arrested? Or, she was a traitor, really. And these are all the things that I would like to know more about, that I suspect there's a huge amount more to come out.
Yes, because she was never interrogated. People were surprised by that. I was going to ask you, was it a challenge to write a group biography? I mean, in the past, you've now moved on to group biography, but at that time, you were doing single lives.
Yes. I suppose there were structural things, but I don't think I did find it particularly difficult. All I remember is that I did it terribly quickly. I think it just sort of, I did know a certain amount of it already because of Nancy. And I don't know, it just sort of, I think once I'd written the introduction, which I was quite pleased with, trying to analyze why they still interest people. So once I did, I think that took about a month and the rest of it took about 3 months. Because once I'd got that sorted, you know what I mean by, it sort of cohered quite easily, because their lives do dovetail, because they're constantly, that dynamic of the sisters, they're constantly reacting off each other and in competition with each other and rivalries. And as you said earlier, different little factions set, Nancy and Jessica would gang up because they were the left wingers. And then Nancy and Diana would gang up because Jessica was such a, behaved so hysterically and blah, 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 blah. But the extraordinary alliance that always remained intact was Jessica and Unity. And Jessica turned violently upon Diana. And Diana herself said, the reason I stayed in prison long after all the other fascist women. The reason I stayed in prison for something that I hadn't actually done, but for what I might have done for so long, was because they couldn't do it to Unity. And I think there probably was something in that, because Diana did have a very young baby. She was arrested. So this was around the time of Dunkirk, when obviously things looked pretty petrifying. He was arrested, Mosely, and then she was arrested not long after. And on the way, they said, buy a breast pump because she'll be back soon. And she was not back for, well, it was nearly 3.5 years. So she was, and when they were released, the Mosleys, there were sort of riots, rallies in Trafalgar Square, and the comparisons with now are very interesting, I think, because obviously when I wrote the book, Western politics were relative, this is about 8 years ago, our politics were relatively stable, and now they're not. And I constantly think, what would happen now? Would there ever be a modern equivalent? Is Unity comparable with like one of those girls who went off to Shamima Begum? Is she comparable with that? Is that too glib? Is Jessica a kind of Extinction Rebellion or a?
Well, I was going to say that there is a tradition of kind of posh protesters,
Yes,
who maybe are just what other people on the left might call tourists, who are sort of enjoying playing politics. But of course, as you said earlier, these women, they did live it. You don't want to like them. I don't want to like them, any of them, frankly. But you can't help being charmed by them, which of course is fatal. And they were charming. But you also have to admire the fact that they did live their principles, even if they're the principles that we now would reject.
yes.
Wonderful description of Holly Golightly meets Patty Hearst meets the girls and pearls from Country Life. I can't quite remember which one that was, but I suppose a bit of all of them.
Yeah. Yes, because their faces sort of, when you see those marvelous William Acton drawings of them, their faces do sort of converge they're on a spectrum of they're all very good looking, which was obviously part of it. And they do, but that was why I wanted to write that introduction, why I took so long over it, because Unity is like a subject for like a grand opera or something. I mean, and yet she's submerged into this hole whereby one is charmed. And that I do find perplexing and fascinating.
Well, your other great phrase, Laura, they were naturally and comfortably shameless. I really like that.
Yeah.
And that's the nursery, isn't it? That's the nursery. That's because, and we haven't mentioned this, they didn't really ever go to school. They just grew up together.
Well, Unity went to school.
I'm sorry.
So fat lot of good that did. The famous thing of she was expelled, no darling asked to leave. They obviously tried that with her. So they obviously, I mean, there's a really good biography of her by David Price Jones, but the sisters were, well, Nancy was dead by that time, and Diana, one might say, was not although Diana was very honest. That's the extraordinary thing about Diana. And they repudiated that book, and Deborah did, because they said there were too many sort of rumors had been taken as fact in it. And I can understand that. I can understand that they felt that, because it does describe Unity as quite more or less balmy from day one, really. But someone like Betjeman didn't think, Betjeman, who wanted to marry Pam, he adored Unity. And Deborah said, of course she's indefensible, but she was lovable. I know. And this is someone who in 1935 wrote, "I want everyone to know I'm a Jew hater."
When you talk about the Mitford myth and Mitfordian, what do you mean by that?
Well, I suppose them as they're viewed through the prism of Nancy's writing, which her authorial voice, I think, is extremely compelling. it's almost like I say, it's almost like a very clever child. She sort of writes, she hits nails on heads in a way that adult writing sometimes sort of loses the ability to do. And again, her voice has this extraordinary charm, which, you know, that famous bit in Brideshead where he Blanche denounces creamy English charm. And one knows what he means by that. But it is compelling. And I suppose it's that a lot of it's to do with that gift for finding, you know, when Nancy, who was really had an agonizing death. But as she said, there's always something to laugh at. And I suppose it's something to do with that movement toward the light, even in which sounds so sort of paradoxical to say that when we've been talking about unity. But even Unity's letters have a kind of it's. I'm getting in a pickle talking about it because you can't disentangle the times that they lived in and that they responded to. Well, three of them with such radical fervor and really, as you said, lived the darkness. And yet that inserts into the Mitfordian myth.
Well, there's a sort of disconnect, isn't there, between their lives and indeed the lives presented in The Pursuit of Love, which comes out the same year as Brideshead. And it's this very nostalgic picture of a vanished aristocratic Britain, which is presumably part of the appeal in the States, where I think your book did particularly well.
It did, which was lovely, really lovely. They're very, people are very compelled by them out there. Yes, it was. As Evelyn Waugh said to Nancy, who voted for Attlee, you voted for the end of your own existence, as it were. Well, not really, because these things still compel, and they still that class does still exist. It just but I think the humour is key to it, and I suppose Nancy crystallizes that in an enduring sense. I think that there's always something to laugh at. Philosophy is, and they've always got a kind of soap opera resilience, because what life chucked, as well as what they took life on, and bad things happened to them by their own doings, as it were. But also life chucked a lot at them. I mean, Nancy's miscarriages, and Jessica lost 2 children. And, they had losing Tom, who I think was like, in a way, the glue, was peculiarly horrific. And yet they sort of survived. So they're in a weird way, they're inspirational because they're so courageous and resilient and shameless, shame-free. And I do think women particularly are compelled, because today we're told, women are wonderful and you can do whatever you like. And yet we all seem terribly frightened of life somehow, But the nostalgia that they represent, and the image of England that they represent, this really all comes from, what would we think of the Mitfords if Nancy hadn't written The Pursuit of Love? It's, they would be viewed very, very differently, I think.
Well, look, I think you capture them so well in your book, and you're not easy on them. You do make it clear that they were dabbling in dark and terrible things. And, I get the sense that you oscillate between a certain amount of disdain. Maybe that's easier as a woman, I don't know, of their kind of competitiveness with each other, but also maybe a little bit of admiration. I mean, perhaps that's what the readers of the novels and your book will come away with both, I think, to be honest.
I think people admire their confidence as much as anything. When you talked about the shameless thing, I think women admire that. Diana sort of going through Holloway, but still remaining Diana, and the lack of however crazy their choices sometimes were, just the confidence of living, and this rather blithe deployment of humor in the face of extremely unfunny situations. I think women particularly find them compelling in that respect, because, as I say, the world is very easy on women these days, but we all seem to be in a bit of a confusion about everything, and there they are, they're so sure.
And a disregard for convention, free-spirited. In some ways, there's a sort of people almost living vicariously through their lives.
Yes, I think that's absolutely. And they just did not really care what other people thought of them. I mean, Diana, she probably cared what Mosely thought, but she really, really did not care what people thought about her. And that I find rather enviable, particularly as we live in a culture where all we care about is what other people, And when they lived in Dolphin Square briefly, and it was sort of covered with graffiti, fascist scum and much worse. And she wrote to Nancy, I think they think the little housewife's going to clean it up, but really, darling, I can't be bothered. And,
Oh, gosh. Oh, well, thank you so much. We've overstayed our welcome, I think, on, if not for this Zoom call, for the patience of our audience. But I hope people have found it as fascinating as I have. And I really, really do recommend this perfect summer reading.
Oh, thank you, Phil. It's always a joy to talk to you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well,
Bye.
I look forward to another time.
Excellent. Bye now.
Well, that was extraordinary stuff, wasn't it? Amazing tour de horizon, really.
Oh, I do love Laura. She's got such a brilliant way of expressing herself, and she kind of is a very original thinker. Comes through her writing, I think, a lot.
Yes, very good book, but yes, very, very perceptive, and as I say, a lovely turn of phrase.
Fair-minded too, which I think is maybe something we'd like to see as part of our brand. It's very easy, and actually, I mean, it's very easy to sort of say to these terrible, overprivileged women who got involved with awful, terrible men, and they're to be disdained. But there's so much to learn from thinking about their lives, I think, and their time.
Yes, well, I think the way that she wants to relate it to the present day and to see them in context and their influence and their sort of, I suppose, cultural influence, I think that's very interesting. It's very easy just to do a straight biography and leave it as that.
True. So, do you want to talk a bit about some of the upcoming episodes that we have planned out?
Yes, well, we've got Andrew Morton talking about Wallace Simpson. I think he's written the best book about her. We've got Randy.
Second only to you, surely, Andrew.
Well, I touch on only part of the life, but I did draw on Andrew quite a lot. He did a lot of new research for his book. You would have thought everything would have been said. He found new witnesses, including the night nurse who nursed the Duke of Windsor as he was dying. So there's a lot of new stuff there. We've got Randy Tarabelli talking about JFK's wife, Jacqueline Onassis. I think, what else we got? We've got possibly the David
We're looking
Kelly
at the Epstein story, aren't we? We're hoping to do something more on Epstein.
I hope so. Yes, we've got a line out to someone who's one of probably the best journalists on the Epstein story. I think possibly we should be looking at Hunter Biden. I mean, that story is now breaking in the news.
That is interesting, isn't it?
And
that
his
is
involvement.
interesting. And yes, that would be fascinating. And another of those stories, a bit like COVID, that it felt very difficult to tell when Trump was president, because people just don't want to be seen to be on the same side as Trump. I mean, I'd be one of those people, to be fair. And yet, there's clearly an enormous scandal and a huge story that's only now beginning to come to light. In fact,
only the mainstream media are dealing with it. But I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff that hasn't come out that I hope can address. And I do admire that judge, the judge that wasn't prepared to take the plea.
Me too.
We need more judges like that. I hate this idea of cozy arrangements behind the scenes.
Well, the story we did last week with Matt Ridley about the origins of COVID, that seems to generate more headlines every week. Just today, there's a very big expose in the Australian newspaper, digging deeper into this whole area of scientists kind of suspecting that the laboratory was involved, but not wanting to go there for very good reasons, actually, because they were terrified of this pandemic. They needed the cooperation of the Chinese. And at that stage, of course, nobody knew whether there'd ever be a vaccine. So, you can, I think, understand why this happened, but it's nevertheless emerging now as a real scandal. I think we should go back to COVID.
Yes, I agree. Well, maybe our own little contribution with Matt contributed to the media beginning to take it more seriously. Who knows?
It would be nice to think so, wouldn't it? All right.
So
Enjoy your holiday. I think our audience would love to know what an Andrew Loney holiday involves. Do you have a deerstalker hat? Do you take a picnic basket? Is that the sort of thing? That's how I imagine you.
Well, I'm sitting in a chalet in a place called Villars, which of course you know, and it's raining, unfortunately. So, but the plan is to go walking. Very few tourists, which is great. It's a very pretty village, as you know. So yes, no, the deer stalking and the grouse shooting starts a little bit later.
Okay, absolutely fine. All right, have a great week. Think deep, scandalous thoughts, and I'll see you and hopefully some of the audience next week.
See you then. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandalmongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.